Poceski, who you have already knew through previous lectures. Now, tonight, the professor is going to share his interpretation and also reading of one of the most famous Chan stories, which concerns, again, one of the two best known Chan masters of Tang China. That is the story of Chan master Nanquan scaling a cat. Now, like before, after the talk, the professor is going to take questions. I'm sure you will have many, as the obvious message of this story goes so much against what we normally know about the fundamental principles of Buddhism, especially in terms of disciplinary rules. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Poceski. Please.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for joining yet another lecture in the series on Chan Buddhism. This is the 9th lecture in the series. And though the title might indicate it's my interpretation of this particular story, or this particular Gong'an, actually I'm more looking into how the Chan tradition, various Chan masters and Chan texts interpreted the story. So it's kind of looking, I guess you can say, surveying interpretations of a particular story. And then by doing that, hopefully looking at some major, larger topics or more general issues in terms of the history of Chan and the development of its literature and practices and outlooks and so on. And then the last lecture will be next week. It's about Chan prophecies, but also maybe towards the end of the lecture, I'm thinking of adding a little bit discussion of some of the topics that I could have included in this lecture series, but I didn't, including Chan in contemporary China, Chan in Japan, Korea, and so on. Very, very briefly, 10 lectures is a lot. That's what is it, 20 hours of talking, and it's also a lot, not just to talk, but also, of course, to prepare all of this, even though I have written on most of these topics, but we cannot cover everything. So I'm going to talk about Chan prophecies, but also I'm going to kind of broaden that up, and towards the end, maybe suggest what could be additional topics for further discussion. And also I welcome questions and comments from the audience, both today, but also in advance to the last meeting. So if there were some themes or issues that members of the audience might be interested to hear or learn more, but haven't been addressed in the lectures, please send it. Yeah, you can email it and so on, or you can also today kind of put it in the chat. As a topic for possible discussion. So I'm going to start with a story, but before we do the story, let's do a short contemplation. Let's contemplate cats, especially cute young cats, kittens like this. So just sit quietly, maybe for a moment, and just contemplate. Think about or reflect or meditate on cats. All right, I guess it would be nice to do that for a whole hour, just to sit quietly and to meditate, but I have to go on with the work of talking about the topic. So, having contemplated a cat, and hopefully maybe you have some experiences, memories of particular cats, or just looking at this image and so on, just as how to say, think about the cat, but also feel the cat. Now, I want to shift to think about monks, Buddhist monks, especially the Chinese monastery. Could be an image like this or other images you have seen, or perhaps what you imagine Chan monks or Buddhist monks in general to be doing in a monastery. Could be the meditation hall, could be the main hall, rituals, could be eating, working outside, walking, talking. So think about monks in the context of monastic life, as you understand it. All right, having reflected on cats and having reflected on monks, let me tell you the story. So the story basically have here the original, well, one of the versions, there are several. I'm going to introduce another version in a moment, but the best known version of the story of Nanquan goes like this. So the setting is Nanquan's monastery, and you have two groups of monks, monks of the Western Hall and the Eastern Hall, and they're quarreling over a kitten. And then Nanquan comes and he tells the monks who are quarreling over the cat, if you are able to say something, if you're able to say something here means something that is deep, profound, or reflects reality or something like that. That's how this is interpreted, this statement. So that's why in the parentheses I've added that accords with reality, then you will save the kitten. If you cannot say anything pertinent, then I will kill the kitten. Or kind of more like behead the kitten, actually. So it's kind of even more violent than just killing. The monks look at Nanquan, and they're stupefied and not being very spiritually sophisticated or highly evolved. They don't know how to respond. And then Nanquan grabs the kitten and beheads the kitten. And then later on, Zhao is the best known disciple of Nanquan. So he comes back to the monastery, presumably he was somewhere outside. And then Nanquan tells him, well, this is what happened. And then Zhao, in response to the story of Nanquan killing the kitten, takes off his shoes, puts it on his head, and walks out. And Nanquan said, if you were, or if Zhao was here earlier, he would have saved the kitten. That is to say, he had something to say, or maybe not just say, but demonstrate. To say something means to demonstrate the truth, right? Verbally, but here Zhao is doing it through gesture, through action. So as in the introduction, you were told this is one of the best known stories in Chan literature. So I'm not going to talk so much in terms of how to interpret the story from my perspective, but I'm going to look at different ways how these stories was understood and interpreted over the centuries, all the way to the present by various Chan writers, masters, followers of Chan, and so on. So this version of the story appears in Jing de Chuandeng Lu. This is a major Chan collection. I already spoke about it in some detail, and I mentioned it a number of times in the series. This was a text that was compiled in 1004, so it's a huge, it's in 30 Chuan or 30 fascicles, and so this is a particular version of the story. There is an earlier version of the story, kind of about half a century, 52 years exactly before. It appears in another text that I mentioned in some of the previous lectures, Futangji. This is our Hall of Patriarchs collection. This is kind of in the same style, like Chan chronology, like Jingde Chuandeng Lu. But this was a text that was lost and then discovered in Korean monastic collection in early 20th century. So in this story, Nanquan is not an abbot of a monastery, but he is a young monk. So this kind of takes place supposedly in terms of the chronology of Nanquan's life several decades earlier. And of course, Zhao Zhou is not part of the story. Zhao Zhou maybe was not even born, or if he was born, he was not a disciple. He was a child somewhere. We don't know the exact year in terms of putting this in chronology of their lives. So he's a head monk in the monastic hall, and he have a kitten. He's taking care of the kitten, and then the kitten does something, messes up the sitting platform, something, and then there is a verbal squabble among the monks. And then somebody tells this to Deshan, and supposedly this happened at the monastery of Deshan. Deshan is another Chan master. When Nanquan was younger, he studied with him. He's known, of course, as a disciple of Matsu Daoi, but Deshan was one of the monks he also studied with. And so Deshan, so in this version of the story, it's Deshan who grabs the kitten and then asks the assembled monks if there's somebody to say something. Is there somebody to say something? Is there somebody, if somebody can say something that accords with truth, that's the presumed meaning here, then he will be able to save the life of this kitten. And again, the monks are stupefied, they're just looking, they don't know what to do, except Nanquan. Nanquan takes a knife and cuts the kitten into two. So this is kind of still very graphic, but the setting, some of the main characters, is a little bit different. So here you can see the story kind of evolves over time. So let me tell you a little bit more about the story and how to contextualize, and then we can look how the story was interpreted. And then what does it tell us about the nature of Chan exegesis or commentary on canonical texts? And how is that embedded in larger developments within the Chan school during the Tang Song transition? So the main protagonist, and I'm going to be focusing on the first version of the story because that's the one that is kind of, you can say, classical or standard. All commentaries are focusing on that. The second version is kind of ignored, is found in this text that disappeared in China and it was uncovered. So the story, the version of the story we are going to be talking about today is the one that features Zhao Zhou. So the main protagonist is, of course, Nanquan. And Nanquan, I mentioned him in some of my previous lectures. He's one of the best-known Chan masters from the Tang Dynasty. He was a disciple of Matsu. Probably he was not as prominent during his lifetime as kind of he became later on, in part because of stories like this, actually, and in part because he was a teacher of Zhao Zhou, who also became very important master and so on. The second protagonist is the nameless cat. And kind of usually the role of the cat is kind of pushed to the sideline, but actually, especially if you're animal lover, but even if you're not, I think the cat plays an important part of the story. And then the secondary characters are the monks of Nanquan's monastery, who apparently are not very kind of spiritually evolved. They cannot respond to this particular situation. They cannot come with a particularly profound, insightful answer. Not only that, but actually, as far as the story goes, looks like the monks never got the point of what Nanquan was making. So in a sense, the cat, unless you get enlightened now listening to the story, the cat was killed for no reason, because the monks, there was no indication that the monks had any particular insight, even after the kid. I mean, obviously before the killing of the cat, the monks didn't have response, so they didn't understand what the main point Nanquan was trying to do. But after killing the cat, they still didn't understand, right? Except Zhao Zhou. And here, in the later version of the story, and especially in some commentaries, actually Zhao Zhou emerges as a major protagonist. The setting of the story is, of course, Nanquan's monastery in what is now Anhui province. The monastery, actually, this is a side note, These are some pictures I took at the monastery 3 years ago when I was last time in China. This was before the year before the pandemic. And the monastery is being rebuilt. It was completely destroyed. There was nothing there. And this monk, he's an abbot of a monastery. He's rebuilding another monastery, Jiuhuashan, a holy Buddhist mountain, also in Anhui province, which is associated with Dizang Bodhisattva. So he got this land. He persuaded local authorities to give him the land, the kind of where the monastery was located. And the only thing that remained is this foundation of a stupa, old stupa, and there are some relics inside. And then what the monk did was he built a pagoda on the top of the ancient stupa. And then this is the meditation hall. It was mostly built when I went there. When I was there, they were building the main hall, and I just checked with some sources I have that know about the situation there. Apparently, the main hall have been rebuilt. Well, built really, so there was nothing there to begin with. But yeah, you can say rebuilt in a sense of there was once upon a time something. And this is kind of, this is the abbot here, and this is the abbot standing next to a picture, to a statue, sorry. This is a picture of Nanquan you find from woodblock prints editions of portraits of Chan masters and so on. Yeah, it's going to appear later in the lecture. So here you can see modern Chan master continuing the legacy, or at least trying to continue the legacy of Nanquan, in part by rebuilding the site of Nanquan's monastery. And the idea is to have also a place where people can come to practice meditation. So. All right, so as I said, my main point here is not to offer my own explanation of the story, but really to look at what does the exegesis, the explanation of the story, tell us about the development of Chan, especially during the Sung period. So that is to say, I want to look at normative Chan, and here kind of I'm also going to expand, not just talk about China, but also we are going to look at Japanese commentaries, because this story becomes very popular and very important in Japanese Zen tradition as well. So kind of what are some of the normal Chan and Zen models of exegesis? And for those of you who are not into biblical studies or religious studies, exegesis basically is a technical term that refers to critical interpretation of a text, especially a sacred text. Like in biblical exegesis is critical interpretation of the Bible, the narratives of the Bible. And also, obviously in one lecture I cannot cover everything, and that's my point. I use this story to talk about interpretation of particular type of Chan narrative, a story that depicts morally questionable, eccentric behavior, seemingly pointless utterances. So there are quite a few. The story of Nanquan killing the cat or beheading the cat is really maybe the most graphic example of violent behavior you find in Chan literature. But there are all kinds of stories that kind of veer into antinomian direction that kind of can be understood to be morally questionable, at least from the standpoint of conventional morality. So I want to look at how Chan school interprets stories, Gong'ans in general, and more specifically this type of story that Nanquan story represent. And also like a little bit about how these stories were created and why they are created, but also what guides their interpretation. What are some of the assumptions that are brought to the fore? What are some of the implicit beliefs? What are some of the ideological commitments that interpreters or Chan Zen master bring to the fore? What are some of the institutional strictures and constraints that shape that exegesis and so on? Now, also, I think this discussion is helpful not only for understanding the nature of Chan exegesis, of Chan interpretation of its own literature, but also we can take that to a comparative perspective, and we can compare Chan exegesis to exegesis in other traditions. What are some of the points of convergence, some of the points of similarity? What are some of the differences or points of divergence? And especially helpful in that respect is biblical exegesis. So towards the end of the lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about some kind of comparative perspective and maybe introduce some ideas about how we can compare biblical exegesis to Chan interpretations of these kind of morally questionable or ambiguous stories. Now, looking at the story itself, putting aside everything else, just focusing on the story, the first thing, and this was what was brought in the introduction when the lecture was introduced and I was introduced, is the ethical considerations, right? Obviously, this seems to go against perhaps the most basic precept of Buddhism against killing, right? So do not kill. 5 precepts, of course, in monasticism you have. In monasticism, in the Vinaya, of course, there is injunction against killing anything, but that's why monks are not even supposed to do gardening, like dig the earth, because they might incidentally kill some worms or insects. Now, there is a distinction in the Vinaya between killing a human being and killing an animal. And killing an animal is bad, it's prohibited, but killing a human being is a higher level of offense. So this will be the parajika offense, one of the 4 parajika, the higher levels of offense. But killing animals definitely is against the Vinaya, and it's against the 5 precepts, it's against the basic outlook of Buddhist ethics. And this brings the specter of Chan antinomianism, this kind of notion that Chan monks or Chan masters do not follow conventional modes of morality, that they can transgress morality. And perhaps from a Chan perspective, we can say, they do that for a higher reason, maybe to manifest some kind of truth or essence of reality or whatnot. But definitely the first thing that we notice about the story is the ethical context, the ethical consideration, that this is kind of not usually how Buddhist monks are supposed to behave, going around with knives and killing animals. Now, in the context of Chan literature from the Song period, this kind of fits into a larger pattern of radical Chan teaching methods, right? So we have all these stories about Chan monks doing eccentric things, screaming, shouting, beating their disciples, saying strange things, and so on. So these, according to conventional interpretation, supposed to be some kind of revolution, not just in rhetorical styles, but also maybe also in teaching methods that supposedly is associated, especially with the Hongzhou school, of which Nanquan is a major representative. And why is the Hongzhou school? Because if you look at early Chan, like if you look at the platform scripture of the 6th patriarch, Liu Tzu Dangjing, and other kind of earlier records, there is no indication of this kind of radical teaching method and eccentricity. Some scholars have tried to draw connections, but really the connection is tenuous. And then in the records of figures associated with the Hongzhou schools around this period, like late 8th, early 9th century, then you have more and more, except that all these records that depict this kind of eccentricities are not really from the Tang Dynasty, they are much later records, and I'm going to talk about it in a moment. So then, if you look also at the story, I mean, there's kind of strange elements. I mean, it's very dramatic. So like if you try to make a movie, a popular movie, like some kind of horror movie set in a monastery, maybe this is a very good dramatic setting, right? So you have the hall, it's dark, monks squarely, cat, the master comes with a knife, he says something, the monks are stupefied, and then he kills the cat, and there is blood splashing all over the place. I mean, so but at the same time, like unruly and ignorant monks in a monastery. Well, maybe, perhaps you can find, if you have been enough to monastery, maybe. How about fights over pets? I lived in a monastery for 12 years when I was younger, from age of 18 to 30, I never saw anything resembling monks fighting over pets, and I've never heard of any other place. So this is a little bit more unusual, okay? This is a little bit weird. Monks going around with knives. That's even more unusual. Here you can see in this painting, actually it's quite a, I don't know, I've never tried to kill anything in my life. But I presume if you are able to behead a cat, even if it's just a small kitten, probably you have to have quite a large knife, right? It's not like a pocket knife or something like that. So then you have the abbot of the monastery walking around with a knife. That sounds strange, a little bit unlikely, right? And then, of course, the violence. Again, I wanted you to think about the cat, and I want to imagine that kind of cute kitten being beheaded in front of other people. All right. So they're kind of, so if you look at the story, is this plausible? Like, could something like this have happened? Well, strange things happen, perhaps, but probably not likely. So this brings us to this larger issue about the historicity and veracity of the stories. Is this depiction of actual events? The short answer is almost certainly no. The story appeared centuries after, even the Zhu Tangji version is well over a century after Nanquan's passing away. So there is no direct connection between Nanquan and this story. And the same goes to Zhao Zhou. So in terms of the story, it's not really about Nanquan, it's not about his teachings or anything like that. It's a story that later somebody created about Nanquan, and that story is important because it became important for the tradition, and many monks commented, and I'm interested to look at those commentaries to understand why they commented and how they commented and so on. But really today, I'm not really talking about Nanquan at all. Even though he seems to be the main characters, because the story really have nothing to do with Nanquan as a historical person. Nanquan as a memory, Nanquan as it was imagined later on, yes. Nanquan maybe as he's understood today, but people could take this story as to be a representation of actual events. Yes, Nanquan as a historical person who had flesh and blood and did certain things, not really. And then, so this kind of different version, and there is much more to tell about the origin of the story, the writing style, and so on. But these kind of bring us back to the convoluted provenance and the transmission of this text within the Tang and the Sung milieu. And this is, of course, a theme that I spoke about in more detail when I spoke about the evolution of Chan literature and the distinctive genre. So if you want to learn more, I would suggest to go back to that lecture. If you missed it, it's available on YouTube. So that much about the Nanquan and the story. So, but the story, once the story is written, and more importantly, when the story becomes codified, because it becomes important part of the Buddhist canon, then is subjected to all kinds of interpretation or exegesis. And then how do you interpret? I mean, you have a choice, right? You look the story on its own, outside of various contexts, outside of various milieus, whether ideological assumptions or institutional strictures and whatnot. So you have different choices. You can interpret the story in different ways. One path that is taken, and this is the path that is usually taken by Chan and Zen commentators, is a very conservative approach. It's a narrow exegetical path. Basically, it's built about certain assumptions about Nanquan. It doesn't question the origins of the narrative, so it takes that this to be depiction of actual events, or at least something that reveals some profound truth that is associated with Nanquan. So it's kind of, this operates within certain parameter of orthodoxy. This is certain orthodox understanding of Chan, what Chan masters are like, what Chan teachings is like, or realization, quest for Chan through the realization of it is like. So you have certain parameters of orthodoxy, and you have very conservative approach which interprets the story within those parameters. And this is the main point I'm trying to make, that if you look at all the commentators from the Sung dynasty to the present, everybody operates within the same hermeneutical circle. Everybody is just following the same line of interpretation. Nobody is able to think outside of the box. And then the other interpretive possibilities are not even considered. And of course, to consider other interpretive possibility means to think outside of the box, to be open-minded to different possibilities of looking at Chan, interpreting, and so on. The most obvious explanation of the story is that this is just a bad story that glorifies violence. I mean, I'm not saying this is how you should be interpreted, but it's a possibility. If normal person, like if I go out on the street and ask people, this is the story, tell me what you think, you know, without the burden of Orthodox tradition, I don't think they will necessarily say, oh, this is so deep, this is so profound, this is entry point into ultimate truth manifested by a perfect master or anything like that. So these are different choices. I'm not saying you should take one or the other. I'm not here to tell you what's the right choice, though I might have some ideas. But what is interesting is that the whole tradition, we are talking about like now almost 1,000 years, is basically following the same exegetical model with some variations. So from the Sung all to the present, basically everybody is repeating the same story. Now, the story itself, in terms of its structure, is constructed in what in Chan scholarship often we refer to as the encounter dialogue model. I spoke about it when I was speaking about Chan literature. So this is said to be a unique model of Chan discourse. Usually have a Chan master and some disciple or disciples, and they engage. Usually these stories are quite short. Many of them are much shorter than the story I just gave you. So it's supposed to be unscripted, spontaneous interaction between an enlightened master and his disciples. And it's supposed to be some kind of ingenious or spontaneous display of master's supreme wisdom and spiritual virtuosity, in which he points to the ultimate nature of reality, of guide students to shift their perception, to bring about certain experience of looking, or kind of, you can say, a cognitive shift in which they kind of abandon their preconceived notion and open themselves to different experience of knowing reality. Or to put it another way, it's meant to bring about awakening among the disciples. So often in these stories, what you have is the master says something or does something weird or dramatic or whatnot, kills or kicks or says something strange or some kind of paradoxical statement, and then often the disciple either becomes awakened, have awakening, or the disciple is stupefied, just does not get the point, and then the master will say something like what a moron or what a fool, or kind of, yeah, hopeless cases, something along those lines. I'm just paraphrasing here. So this is again supposed to be part of these unconventional teaching techniques that supposedly were introduced by the Chan masters, where we have shouting, hitting, making paradoxical statements, and so on. That is to say, this is the origin of the koan stories, right? And sometimes some people, both from a traditional and also from scholar perspective, have suggested this is a unique path of practice, that really Chan monks hone their skill by engaging in these kind of combats with Chan masters. They go there and they ask some kind of questions, and the master then responds, and they have this kind of wanda exchange. I think this is really off the wall. I mean, I can see how by reading the history and maybe reading writing of Suzuki or somebody like that, you can arrive at that kind of ideas. But in practical reality, it's in terms of knowing institutions, a topic I think it was last week, right? I spoke of monastic life, really, and also in terms of human psychology, this is not how religion works. So this kind of notion that this was a main mode of practice, that the monks were not doing meditation, following precepts, just going to monasteries and honing their skills and seeking enlightenment by engaging in this kind of combats, it's highly problematic, to put it politely from a historical perspective. All right, so basically, and this is what is happening here. So this dialogue, this kind of dialogues first appear in Zhu Tangji. So we are talking about mid-10th century. So this is again 170 years after, for example, Matsu dies, and Matsu is featured in some of these dialogues. So this is very, very quite late. But really, even in Zhu Tangji, this is not as dominant form of narration, or it's not the most central part of Chan narratives or Chan modes of discourse. But then certainly by the Sung dynasty, if you look at Jing de Zhuangdanglu, this becomes the dominant form of narration. So it's Jing de Zhuangdanglu, if you look at the text, it's just choke full. I mean, this is a Taiwanese edition. So if you look at one after another, is choke full of these kind of stories. And so you have real proliferation of encounter dialogues. But then if you go back to the time of Nanquan, the historical person, there is no evidence that even no awareness, there are no records of encounter dialogues, nothing like that. And for example, if you look at Baolin Chuan, which is important chronicle, which most of it is preserved, there are some parts that are missing, and Japanese scholars have tried to reconstruct the last couple of Chuan, it's in 10 Chuan. So if you look at that, there is no inkling. I mean, there was no awareness that such a thing existed during the time of Nanquan, let alone that, that's what the really monks were doing at the time. And this is what I've been doing in some of my research, my books and articles, is to really look beyond these kind of interpretations of Chan Masa from the Tang and gather the sources that seems to be more reliable and contextualize them, put them in the context, the historical, the literary, the social, cultural context of the Tang dynasty, and to really understand what these people were doing. And personally, from my perspective, what they seems to be doing and saying is much more interesting than the stories about monks going around with knives and killing kittens or saying some weird stuff. But there are different takes. Some people, and most people, I would say, who are interested in Zen probably will have a different take on that. All right. So basically what we have, these kind of stories are developed within the context of Sung Dynasty Chan Buddhism. And one of the important features of these stories is that the main protagonists tend to be famous masters from the Tang Dynasty. Especially, you have some five dynasties, Wutai masters like Biyan, for example, but by and large, like Matsu, Baichang, Nanquan, Zhaozhou, especially Nanquan and Zhaozhou seems to be very popular in terms of how they're featured in this kind of collection. So this is kind of, and then the question comes, understanding the thought, the ideas, the lives, the commitments, the legacies of the real legacies of these important Chan masters. How does it tally with this later tradition of storytelling? Is this, certainly it's reinterpretation. I mean, if you read, like, for example, my books about the Hongzhou school, about Matsu's literature, and compare with the stories, it's something that is very, very, very different. And I suggested that also when I was talking about Matsu and Baichang. So this is a theme I addressed in some of the earlier. So you can say that basically this kind of classical Chan stories represent reimagining of Tang Chan, right? So in that sense, they're very, very creative. They kind of type of religious literature which tries to rethink, reconstruct, reformulate, reimagine a previous tradition. And that involves, of course, reinterpretation or by and large misinterpretation of what the basic teachings, outlooks, life of Chan masters from the Tang are. And of course, you can say this is not a major, I mean, we are not talking here about journalism or about narrow understanding of history. I mean, much of religion is reimagining previous traditions, reimagining the images of founding patriarchs, sages, and so on. So that's what makes the tradition living. But at the same time, in terms of understanding the reality of what was happening to the Tang Dynasty, going by these sources, that's not very helpful. It's actually quite misleading. But what also represents, if you compare what some of the earlier sources, starting with the still inscriptions, which typically are composed during just after the passing away of a particular master, and then this later story, you can see the changing image of the Chan master. And again, that was the topic I addressed before, when I talk about the institutionalization of Chan and how to look at the changing image of the Chan master by looking at Max Weber's theory of routinization of charisma. So we have different representations of Chan masters, and this is part of this kind of development of a new Chan tradition, which to a large degree establishes its authenticity and orthodoxy by creating this new reimagined, reformulated version of Tang Chan. So Sung Chan is changing, codifying, and important part of that codification is to rearrange, rethink, recodify, reimagine what Tang Dynasty Chan is, as exemplified by the great masters, including Nanquan, and then to draw that kind of connection between what are the agendas, the concerns, the beliefs, the practices of Sung Dynasty Chan, and this reimagined, reconstituted Tang Dynasty tradition, right? Now, so these bring us, so what do we make out of these stories? Now, from the perspective of Sung Dynasty Chan and from the perspective of Chan all the way to the present and including modern Zen masters and whatnot, they're repositories of ancient wisdom. These are the words and the deeds of great masters who reveal truths, who guide humanity to go beyond their self-imposed limitations, to look clearly, to transcend the dualities, to realize the truth, and so on. Another interpretation is, if you look at the stories, and again, I'm talking in general terms, some of the stories might be very educational, kind of my point in certain interesting direction, but most of the stories, believe me, I mean, if you want to be punished, go to a prison for 3 months and just be forced to read most of these stories in Jingdong Zhuangdao. We tend to pick up some, but most of them are just repetition of the same stuff, just with different names and one eccentricity, one strange statement. I mean, for me, this will be one version of hell, to be in a cell and to have to listen to this kind of stories. Again, some of the stories are good. I'm kind of talking in a more general way. So maybe, I mean, one way to compare many of these stories is like this kind of postmodernist discourse. That's where this fashionable nonsense term, it comes from a title of a book that was published, I believe, maybe 20 some years ago. It was a critique of postmodernist writings, especially French, and how they misuse scientific ideas and so on. But this is maybe medieval versions. They create this kind of stuff that is supposed to be deep and profound, but maybe it's not as deep as profound, or at least that's, again, I'm not saying this is how you should interpret it, but this is a possibility. All right. So in case you kind of read or interpret or understand what I'm trying to say is that I'm against storytelling, that's certainly not the case. Storytelling can be very useful. It's important feature of human life, and we live our lives through stories, including the telling of the story of our own lives. And this is how traditions are created, religious tradition, cultural traditions transmitted by telling stories and preserving communal memories and so on. Also, in terms of Sung Dynasty, China, I'm not saying that there was nothing creative, I mean, or prolific. They certainly created lots of texts. Now, whether you find these texts to be something deep or profound or creative or not, and what I'm suggesting is there are two possibilities here, not only one. So there could be very deep and profound many of the stories, so they might be not. But there's certainly something that is very prolific. I mean, they create lots of stories, lots of texts, and so on. But at the same time, if you look at the stories, again, I'm talking about aggregates, of course, the individual stories. I mean, definitely you can see that it's something that is mass-produced. I mean, there are lots of repetitions, same themes. So it looks like if individual story, if you look like it seems to be iconoclastic, it seems to be new, it seems to be spontaneous. But actually, if you read the literature as a whole, if you read the whole of Jingde Chuan Dengu and take all the Gong'an or all the stories and counter dialogues, you see there is endless repetition of the same tropes, of the same questions, of the same themes, variations. So it's kind of very formulaic. And it's repetitive. And again, you can interpret these stories in a variety of ways: essence, function, non-duality, duality, and so on. Sure, you can input all kinds of interpretations, in part because the stories, for the most part, are very vague. But like for a person who is outside the tradition, the stories seems to be a little bit pointless, at least many of them, maybe not all. But so, for example, you have this question about the patriarch Bodhidharma, so just the patriarch in the Zusha in Chinese. So what's the meaning of patriarchs coming from the West? And then so this question comes again and again and again. There are many questions, and then there are formulaic answers. And the master said, what's the Dharmakaya? And then human says pancake or whatever, something like that. Now you can impute all kinds of interpretations, but you can see like there is lots of repetition, and not just in the stories, but also in the commentaries, a theme to which I'm going to come back later on. So, so the stories, basically to understand not just the emergence of these stories, but its use within various Chan milieux, we have to go back to the evolution of Chan literature, another topic that I discussed. So probably some of you who listened to the previous lecture remember I was talking about the evolution of Chan literature and the development of distinctive Chan genres. So one of those genres were the Gong'an collections, which become increasingly important during the Song dynasty. Perhaps the two most famous ones are Biyan, Blue Cliff Record, and Woman Guan, Woman's Passage. Often Woman Guan is translated in English as Gateless Passage, because woman means, well, no door or no gate, or but really woman is the name of the author. So in that sense, it's kind of probably better to read it as Woman's Passage. So, kind of there are distinctive features of them, but some of them, especially perhaps Biyan is maybe the most useful in terms of understanding the genre. It's kind of convoluted provenance. I'm going to explain in a moment how the text came to be. It's not something that was written in a single go. There are many different elements. So the provenance, the making of the text is kind of complicated, and the structure is even more complicated. So maybe let's leave that for a moment. And then the language, maybe Woman Guan is much more direct, in part because it's supposed to be Lynchy, kind of more direct approach. I mean, Yuanwu, the compiler of Biyan was also kind of within the Lynchy lineage, but it's kind of much more verbose. The language is highbrow, so it's the kind of language where like a eminent Chan monk would try to use to impress his literati supporters and friends, and the exegesis is very, very convoluted, and sometimes it's very difficult to see direct connection between the text, the story, and the commentary. And of course, these collections are also interpreted into the context of the emergence of new type of meditation practice, the so-called technique of Kanhuato, or observing the critical phase, or observing the world. I spoke about it in some detail when I was talking about the development of meditation and the place of Chan within that large evolution of Buddhist meditation theory in China. I don't know, I think maybe it was lecture 5 or something like that in the series. So if you're interested, you can link it. So there's this kind of connection where we have development of a literature organized around this Gong'an, and then meditation techniques which involves meditation, this Gong'an. That's how usually it's presented. I've been studying now Chan Buddhism for most of my life. In my 50s, I started when I was in my late teens. And this connection between actual meditation practice, whether it's Kanhua or something like that, and these Gong'an collections as literary artifacts, I still have to see the direct connection. I mean, when you look at the exegesis, the commentary, I still don't see what these have really got to do with meditation practice, especially in a meditation practice that is kind of in many ways just a form of samatha meditation. Concentration, it's not so much even the reflection on the koan, it's focus on like Zhao Zhou's Wu. So the technique itself, but definitely some of the Gong'ans that are commented upon are there. They're taken from the collections, but in terms of the commentary, the verse and so on, I still fail to see. Other people seems to see the connections. That's certainly how the tradition represented. Maybe the connection is like we have meditation retreat and the Zen master, especially in Japan, will give lectures on like woman guan, the guans and so on. So there is that kind of connection, but in terms of the actual exegesis, the text and actual meditation practice, I'm unable to see direct connection. So maybe I'm limited in some way, or maybe other people are imagining connections that are not there. I'm not sure which one it is. But yeah, but again, different possibilities of interpreting. There is not just one way to look at it. So going back to Nanquan's story, so what we have, it appears in most major collections, including the three most important one. So in Blue Cliff record is divided into two parts actually. So there are two Gong'an or two cases. So it's case 63 and 64. The first part is basically Nanquan killing the cat. The second one is Zhao Zhou putting sandals on his head and walking out. And this is, and then in woman Guan is case 14, and then in Zongrong Lu or Record of Serenity, it's case number 9. I don't have time to go over the exegesis in all three, so I'm mostly going to be focusing on the first one. Again, we have time constraints and whatnot, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Yuanwu's exegesis in Blue Cliff record, and then I'm going to talk about some later kind of interpretations that kind of follow the same line. Now, the making of first, before we go into Yuanwu's interpretation of the story, let me say a few things about the making of Biyan Lu. So, kind of, it's a complicated case of literary creation. So first, there's a Chan master called Shadow, and he basically picks up 100 Gong'ans and make a collection of 100 Gong'ans, and then he writes verses on each one. So he makes the selection, and then he writes verses that supposedly elucidate or reflect on the topic of the Gong'an. And of course, 2 of them are related to Nanquan's story. And then later on, almost a century later, then you have Yuanwu, who was one of the most famous or influential Chan masters of his time. He picks up this text, these verses on 100 ancient cases, and then he adds elaborate layers of exegesis, which kind of take the stories and the verses as a starting point, and then he adds many, many other elements. The title sometimes you have Lu and or Ji, they're different versions. In Japan, sometimes you find this, but it's the same text. Just the title sometimes represented a different way. So as I already indicated, the narrative structure of this Gong'an collection, of Yuanwu's Gong'an collection, is quite complicated. So basically, you have 100, it's divided into 100 parts, right? So you have 100 cases. And then each case, so you have a pointer, which is kind of like almost like a short introduction to the core case. And this is composed by Yuanwu. So kind of he makes some kind of statement that's supposed to Not introduction in a conventional sense, but kind of almost like point, maybe set you in a mood, you can say, or kind of orient you towards the case, supposedly. And then we have the main case, which is usually a story or exchange taken from an earlier record, Jing de Chuangdelu, other sources. And usually it features famous Chan master like Zhao Zhou, Matsu, Baizhang, and so on. And then within the main case, they also Yuanwu insert certain nodes, interlinear nodes, which are embedded. So you have the pointer, the main case. Within the main case, you have the nodes, and then there's Yuanwu's commentary on the case, which is the longer part. And then and this is written in prose. And then you have the verse written by Xie. And then to make it more complicated, Yuanwu inserts interlinear notes into the verse, and then he writes a commentary on Xie's verse. So kind of quite complicated, isn't it? So there are different layers. Basically, here I have identified seven layers within each case. And so again, what have this got to do with very simple meditation technique, which kind of tries to focus the mind and supposedly lead to breakthrough through which one realizes the true Buddha nature within oneself? I'm not sure, but again, I might be unable to see some profound connections there. All right, so this is a little bit about the structure of the text. So let's look at what Yuan will have to say. So this is the beginning of his exegesis. So he starts on a very, very dramatic note. And so let me read the translation. Where the pathways of ideas cannot get to, that's precisely what we should pay attention to. Where words and explanations fail to reach, that is where we should urgently focus on. If there are bolts of thunder and flying stars, then the stormy waves can topple mountain peak. Is there anyone in the congregation who can make sense of that? Let us test that by bringing up the Gong'an. So this is how he sets you in a mood or introduces Nanquan's spontaneous act of cutting the curtain, revealing ultimate truth for all of us to see and reflect on. What have this got to the story? I don't know, but here you can see these dramatic elements, dramatic imagery, right? So we have these bolts of thunder, flying stars, stormy waves, and the waves topple mountain peaks. If this was some kind of a Hollywood movie or something like that, this would be, or video games, quite dramatic. So it's very creative in that sense. And then the first part, I mean, something that is very conventional, not just about this story. He says that, you know, somehow there is this place that transcends ideas or ordinary ways of thinking, right? And this is where we should go to. And then words and explanations fail to reach. That's where we should focus on. Now the question is, okay, if you have to go beyond words and explanation, then why do you write this? And also, why do you write it in such a complicated way in terms of this multiple layer of exegesis and so on? So there is a kind of an element of paradox here embedded. Anyway, so I don't have time to go over the whole story, but let me, this is the part of the interlinear note. So there is the story, and then there's the section where Nanquan beheads the cat, right? Cuts it into two. And this is his comment on that particular passage. So I'm going to read. How wonderful, how wonderful. If it is not like that, all of them would be like a bunch of foolish guys playing with mud. It's like drawing the bow after the robber have already gone away. It's already too late. It's better to strike before this whole thing is raised up. So what have this got to do with killing a cat? I'm not sure, again. But I'm going to bring around the main comments later on, but also this seems to be like one of the feature of the text is what we can, we in modern parlance, we say a cut and paste strategy. So he seems to be kind of giving these very insightful, very unique perspectives of particular stories and insights that are embedded in those stories. But actually he's repeating the same stuff. For example, what I've marked with kind of, I guess, some kind of red purple color, that passage, drawing the bow after the robber is already gone. Okay, actually, hang on, yeah, so that appears 9 times in the record. So he just repeats the same story in 9 different Gong'an. And the last section also of the last sentence, again, it's repeated elsewhere. So he's kind of almost like having these preset sayings, and he's just cutting them and kind of putting them into different koans, supposedly explaining these spontaneous, unique acts of chant masters, but kind of in a somewhat formulaic way. So what's going on? Well, in order to make this kind of exegesis relatable, to see kind of to figure out what he is doing, is we have to look at some of the what seems to be the operative assumptions here. And this is based on Nanquan's commentary as a whole. So first, Nanquan is a genuine chant master. He's an enlightened person, right? So this is his assumption. How does Yuanwu knows about that? I don't know. I presume he didn't meet Nanquan, so this is kind of, but he is certain that Nanquan is a genuine chant master, and chant master by definition is an enlightened being who have mastered the subtleties of truth and can bring others, guide others to spiritual breakthroughs and so on. And then, so if Nanquan is an enlightened being, that everything he does, all acts, his movement, his stillness, his words, his silences, all coming and going and so on. I'm kind of here paraphrasing what Yuanwu is saying, are grounded in profound insight into the true nature of reality. And since these are the words and the actions and the gestures of enlightened being, it's something that is very deep, and we are supposed to ponder and reflect on, because they provide opportunities or pathways to enter into this profound truth that Chan is supposed to communicate. Then in other places, he kind of waxed poetical. Nanquan had an eye to determine heaven and earth, had the sword to determine heaven and earth. So very, very kind of poetic, but also grandiose like that. So then Nanquan cannot do wrong. So if Nanquan kills the cat, then there may be something very, very deep and very profound. And we have to reflect and to find some deep and profound truth in this seemingly violent act. So as we usually do, we have a break. So let's have a 2-minute break, and then I will continue with the story and its interpretation. All right, I think we can continue now, if you don't mind. So, so these are some of the operative assumptions that seems to guide Nanquan's exegesis of the story. And more generally, I mean, this is assumption not just about Nanquan, but all these Chan masters that are featured in the various Gong'an collections, that basically the enlightened beings who manifest the truth through their words, actions, gestures, and they reveal profound truths that we are supposed to reflect and use as guideposts for reflecting on the true nature of reality within and outside of ourselves, and hopefully arriving at breakthrough as awakening. Let's look at a little bit more at Nanquan's commentary on the main case. This is the Chinese text. Again, I don't have time to go through the whole thing, but I hope I will be able to communicate some of the main features there. So, so in the final analysis, who beheaded the cat? Well, there was no beheading. I don't know which way it means, like literally or figuratively. So, and this is the problem of exegesis: how to gloss over the gruesomeness of the act depicted in the story. Well, one to say, well, there is no real beheading, right? That the point of the story is not about killing cats or violence or anything like that. Now, if that's not the point, then why bring it up, right? What kind of function does violence serve in a story? Anyway, so so he said, but this is very, very clear. And then he warns. So that the deep, profound meaning of the story is not something to be sought within the worldly emotions and opinions. So said, don't dare you interpret your story from your own perspective, or in terms of your own emotional responses or your own ideas and so on. So that's wrong. That's not how you do it. And if you do that, that is to say, if you stray away from the interpretive perspective I'm presenting to you as a commentator, then you betray Nanquan. So what should you do? You should directly gaze at the sharp edge of the knife. Is he talking about real knife? Is the knife metaphor of something, maybe like the sword of Manjushu that cuts ignorance? Not very clear. And then this kind of abstruse discourse. Then existence and non-existence are both acceptable. Neither existence nor non-existence is acceptable. So this kind of very abstruse rhetoric about existence, non-existence, duality, non-duality, and so on, which you find quite a bit in Tang and Sung Dynasty discourse about the nature of reality, not just Chan discourses, but other texts and so on. Except that this is kind of just very general. I mean, this is just repetition of common themes you find through Buddhist philosophical literature. So why do you need to bring a cat and killing to make a point that have been made in Hawaiian metaphysics, have been made in Tiantai by Jie and other monks in a much more systematic, much better way than Yuanwu can ever make. So if it's about explanation of existent, non-existent, transcendence, one mind, non-duality, and so on, yeah, okay, but that's kind of, then you're within the realm of words, and it's kind of in a realm of philosophical discourse that have been already done. You're rehashing something that is well known in Chinese Buddhist circles. So when Nanquan held up the cat and the knife in such matter, it cannot be that he was instructing people to immediately say something special. He was only concerned with instructing people to come forward so that each person can act by himself and arrive at true knowledge of himself. So he's perhaps here talking about the monks in the audience that supposedly witnessed the act, But perhaps he's also talking about the readers, including you. So I told you the story, ladies and gentlemen. So did you arrive at true knowledge of yourself by pondering and reflecting on the wondrous acts of Nanquan and the deep interpretation of his story? Think about it. All right, so this kind of set the stage for certain kind of normative interpretation of the stories that, as I said, are repeated all the way to the modern period. So basically, the story of Nanquan is part of this kind of tradition of Gong'ans, depict the exemplary doings, sayings, gestures, and so on of perfected beings, and in that sense, they are important resources of ancient wisdom, of traditional lore that points to the deepest insight that the Chan tradition have transmitted from one generation to another. And the words and actions of conventional Chan masters, even though they seemingly at times might contradict conventional ethical standards, including maybe featuring violence, like in this case, they shouldn't be questioned or interpreted from conventional point of view, so rational discourse, and so on, talking about animal rights, no killing, and so on. That's behind the point, because this operated some kind of higher level of reality that transcends all those kind of concerns and conventional viewpoints or everyday assumptions about how the world works. But at the same time, I mean, to go into this kind of exegetical mode and to accept it, it kind of ask the reader to accept all kinds of credulous beliefs. I mean, we have to accept that Nanquan is enlightened Chan master. How do you know? Have you met Nanquan? Again, you can absolve Nanquan of all of this because, as I said, the story have nothing to do with Nanquan. But okay, so Nanquan, enlightened master, maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I haven't met them. So this is how the tradition presented, and the action then must be some kind of manifestation of ultimate truth. That's also assumption. Are you sure that's what he did? The story, maybe he was just a violent person. I mean, I'm not saying that's how you should interpret it, but that could be a possible interpretation, which might be what somebody who is outside of the tradition may suggest. So basically you have this kind of, basically you have to assume many things that you as a reader or interpreter, you don't know. So, and this is how tradition operates, right? This is how much of religion operates. I mean, Jesus died on the cross, he was reborn and so on. Of course, you don't know anything about it, but this is what tradition tells you. And then that's how it interprets not just the events, but the significance of the events, both in terms of the course of human history and in a larger cosmic scale, and in relation to God and his power and his presence in the world and whatnot. So basically, you have to credulously accept all kinds of assumptions that are embedded within the exegesis, which is basically reflection of certain type of Chan orthodoxy. And this is the kind of Chan orthodoxy that was becoming normative during the Sung dynasty. So you have creation of these stories, and then commentaries on the stories, but they embedded within certain understanding of what Chan Buddhism is, and what are the images of exemplary Chan master from the Tang dynasty, what the kind of religious ideal they represent, how their actions and words or supposed actions and words should be interpreted, and so on. So basically we have a straitjacket of narrow orthodoxy, and it is within the parameters of that orthodoxy that the story must be interpreted, and you cannot step out, you cannot question, well, maybe the story have nothing to do with Nanquan, well, maybe Nanquan was not enlightened, well, maybe it's not a good story, maybe you shouldn't feature stories of killing animals because, well, we already kill enough animals, so we don't have to justify that, or at least use that as a potential justification, and so on. And one of the amazing features, if you look at the whole tradition, is this kind of inability to adopt a critical stance, to step outside of normative interpretive framework, think outside of the box. So we have this parameter of orthodoxy, and then the whole tradition all the way into the 20th or even 21st century is basically interpreting the story more or less in the same way. And this brings us to notice, so there is another character here lurking in the background. The story is kind of about Nanquan and kind of about his wisdom and kind of about his message for humanity that he tries to communicate through the action of killing the cat. But really, the real power, the real authority is not so much with Nanquan, or maybe in addition to Nanquan, is shared by the exegete, by the Chan master, in this case, Yuanwu, right? So Yuanwu picks up this story and he tells you what the story really means. And he warns you, don't interpret it in terms of your own ideas, in terms of your conventional points of view. And basically, he's asserting his own authority, the authority of the exegete, which by definition is a Chan master, such as Yuanwu, who of course exists also in institutional nexus of power and influence. And I spoke about that when I talk about the institutionalization of Chan and the formation of monastic communities and the determination about other abbotship and the power structure that supports that both within the Buddhist community but also outside in terms of the imperial states and the needs of China. So you have the role of the Chan master of arbiter of orthodoxy, of gatekeeper. He's the one who interprets the story. So in that sense, by engaging in exegesis of the words and actions and other elements of teaching that are supposedly conveyed by various Gong'an that feature prominent Chan masters from the Tang, the Sung dynasty or later, a Chan master assumes a prominent role of arbiter of orthodoxy. So he tells you what the true interpretation, he tells you what Nanquan really meant or didn't mean, or how the story should be read, or how the story should be interpreted. And by doing that, the Chan master not only is interpreted, not Nanquan, but the interpreter, Yuanwu, and later master who interpret the story, so they don't only bolster their authority as inheritors of tradition, but they also assume the role of living embodiments of mythical Chan lineage. And this continues all the way to the present. I was, last month, I was doing some field research at various places, and I went to a Chan master, which was kind of almost, it was one of the Zen monastery, the temple or something, or meditation center. So this is really flourishing during the, especially during the 80s, 90s. This is a major place. Many people, Zen practitioners, including some very famous people, went there. And the master was very, very popular, very charismatic leader. He built this community. It was supposed to be a place of strict practice and so on. And while I was there, it was shared to me that they had this new edition of his lectures on these koans, that just published actually. It was very interesting to see, but the community imploded because there were some big sexual scandals about the master. The master turned out was harassing women and whatnot, and then the whole thing collapsed, and then he died, and so on. So kind of there's the implosion of the whole thing. But it was kind of interesting to me to reimagine. Again, I was not there at the time, but kind of you have this kind of sense of tradition. So it's part of the authority of the modern master, right? Zen master is that he embodies this ancient tradition, and he establishes that connection by having these very, very formal lectures on koans, including this one, right? So kind of this kind of connection that still continues. So basically, so in terms of how Yuanwu positions himself, well, if whatever Nanquan does if Nanquan can do no wrong, right? If everything Nanquan does is expression of ultimate wisdom and profound purpose, then you have lots of artistic or exegetical freedom and license. You can say pretty much everything. You can talk about essence, about function, about non-duality, about transcendence, about Buddha nature, and this and that you can throw around, especially because these kind of texts are a little bit ambiguous, tenuous, and they're all open to all kinds of interpretation. That's kind of the genius, really, on some level of this literature that is so vague and so thorough. So you can, it's open to all sorts of interpretations. But always the interpretation have to stay within certain ideological strictures. It's based on certain assumptions like the one I mentioned. And it's also embedded within certain power structure within certain institutions, at the top of which is the Chan master, the exegetes, who tells you the real meaning and who embodies the tradition that supposedly goes back to Nanquan, to Zhao Zhao, to Dongshan, and so on. And because of that, it's possible to come up with all kinds of oblique, abstruse, fanciful interpretation. You can wax poetical. You can pick up one statement, throw it in one koan, another koan. It's kind of very free, very free-flowing, especially if you can express it in a nice language that will appeal to the literati, to the educated monks. Can basically again, it reminds me some of this, and again, this is my reading, maybe it's misreading, you might have different perspective of much of this postmodernist discourse, this kind of jargon-laden, impenetrable narratives that are full of all kinds of obfuscation, and sometimes this kind of obfuscation are there because there's nothing to really there's no point that they really try to make. It's just kind of in the endless rumblings and going to circles, or sometimes they make a point, but they make a point in a very convoluted sense that can be expressed in much more clearer, much more direct, much more relatable ways, but kind of course, by obfuscating and so on, you basically manifest your own intellectual, in this case, religious virtuosity, right? You can write and can engage in this kind of supposedly deep reflection and discourse and whatnot. All right. So I don't have time to go into too many other commentaries, but basically there are a number of commentaries I've written on this. This lecture in part is based on a chapter from a book I edited. But basically, so you have all kinds of, for example, Sung Yuan, you have various commentaries. There is one example of empty valley anthology from 1285. And this continues all the way to the modern era. So D.T. Suzuki, the famous Japanese missionary who was very influential in the transmission of Zen texts and teachings and ideas from a very skewed perspective to Western audiences. So he comments on these stories. I'm going to introduce that in a moment. Also, modern Taiwanese monk Xing Yan also comment on the stories. Again, I don't have time to go. But I will give you an example from D.T. Suzuki and Shibayama Zenke. Zenke is a modern Zen master, abbot of a major monastery in Japan. So basically, if you look at D.T. Suzuki, sort of, he doesn't have much to say that is new or interesting. So he introduces the story and then he says, what does all this mean? What was a poor, innocent creature sacrificed? Why? Why was a poor, innocent creature sacrificed? What was Joshu's placing his sandals over his head to do with the quarreling? Joshu is Japanese pronunciation of Jiaozhou. Did Nanquan mean to be irreligious and inhuman by killing a living being? So he's bringing this kind of ethical question, which is unavoidable. So usually what they do is bring the ethical question and then gloss over ourselves. Well, don't think about it. That's not really the point. Was Joshu really a fool to play such a strange trick? And then absolute denial and absolute affirmation. So here he is kind of starting again, same strategy, vexing philosophical, right? But here he is kind of trying to attune himself to some kind of more modern kind of ways of philosophizing. So art is really too. There is something fearful earnest in both of these actors, Joshua and Nansen. Fearfully earnest. What could that be? Unless this is apprehended, Zen is indeed a mere farce. But of course, we know from Suzuki's writings that Zen is far from being a farce. It's the essence of all authentic spirituality, Buddhist and otherwise, right? The cat certainly was not killed to no purpose. Good to know. Good to know to the cat. So why don't you also offer yourself to be killed and serve this higher purpose of revealing the truth? Again, keep in mind, none of the monks, even before the killing or after the killing, according to the story, understands, gets an insight, right? So there's no awakening depicted in the story. And I'm not sure, I have never met anybody personally who have awoken to the stories. I'm sure there are people who claim awakening and not any, if you look at the history, yeah. So I'm not sure how, can you really justify the killing because there was some higher purpose if nobody really got awakened? But anyway, if any of the lower animals is ever to attain Buddhahood, this cat was surely then one so destined. Well, good to know. Good to know. I'm sure the cat is very happy to be a Buddha now. All right, so let's look at Shibayama's commentary. I don't have time. It's like this is kind of longish, but let me introduce some of the main themes, which I think kind of highlight some of the points I already made. So first of all, he starts with critique of scholars. Why are scholars unqualified to comment? Scholars like myself, why are we unqualified to comment on Gong'ans like this? Because we lack authentic Zen eye experience to grasp the essence. So poor scholars, they don't have authentic Zen eye, and because they have no Zen eye, how can they possibly grasp the essence that is communicated by these deep and profound stories? And then he reiterates the same themes. These and other stories, they're deep expressions of Zen experience, and experience becomes here a dominant theme, because much of modern Japanese Zen is about triggering this kensho, right? So that you get experience of, well, your true nature, whatever original phase, and so on. So there's this deep experience, and the koan expresses that. And this is completely different dimension of reality that goes beyond all these prosaic conversations about the issues of ethics, of animal rights, of practical activities. This is just completely different realm of reality, completely different register of existence, completely transcends that. And then he goes to the issue of authority. So if scholars, ignorant scholars who try to rationalize, to explain, to contextualize these stories without having the true Zen eye, that is to say the true experience of Zen awakening, if they're completely unqualified to comment on these stories, then who should explain these stories? Who should illuminate the meaning of these stories? Who can bring this wisdom and knowledge to humanity? Well, it's the Zen master like himself, right? He is the main source of authority, and he and only he can interpret what these stories really, really mean, assuming there is a real meaning in the story. Because the Zen master like himself is an inheritor of an ancient Zen tradition. And by extension, the Zen master is also a gatekeeper. If somebody is a guide, so he decides who enters the gate of Zen, who is not, who is qualified, who is not qualified, because he has this supreme wisdom. And also he's a guide that one should follow on the path of spiritual exploration. So this is kind of, you can see, it's kind of, I mean, there's some different elements, but pretty much, so now we are kind of second half of 20th century, and pretty much the same themes are repeated. The supposed wisdom, embedded in the story, the kind of the particular interpretive orientation that one have to adopt, which is embedded in certain patterns of orthodoxy, and the authority of the Chan master as the sole person who is able to penetrate the meaning of the story and explain it to humanity based on usually his, perhaps there's some female masters there as well, to communicate that to humanity, right? Okay, I see there's some, I presume, questions. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt. Just need to think in terms of time. There's some questions. So let me hurry up this so that we can have time for questions. I think I'm kind of coming towards the end here. So let's bring this in a broader comparative perspective. So we have a story that depicts killing of an animal, innocent animal, and that we have all kinds of interpretation, most of which gloss over the act of killing. They say, well, don't worry, it's not about killing, it's about something else, something deep and profound. Well, now, if you look at this, I mean, you have, of course, lots of stories. I mean, actually, Buddhist stories are kind of relatively impoverished when it comes to gore and violence. I mean, this is the best these Buddhists can come up with, killing a cat. If you look at the religious literature of other traditions, there is much more appetite for gratuitous violence. I mean, if, for example, if you read the Bible, it's all kinds of stories that depict violence or kind of questionable viewpoints or dramatic storylines that lead us into kind of uncharted waters, at least in terms of ethical consideration and so on. So basically, and so if you look at the canons, whether it's Christian or Buddhist canon, basically it's a melange of all kinds of elements, right? Even for example, if you look at just one text, Biyan in the Buddhist case, so there are all kinds of elements here. You have the stories that comes from various sources. God knows who created the story of Nanquan. We have no idea. So maybe we are talking about, again, nothing to do with Nanquan, historically speaking, but somebody created the story. Was that person a wise person, or was it a fool? Was it an ethical person, non-ethical person? In terms of monastic, was it a good exemplary monks, or was he, I don't know, somebody else, and so on? But we really don't know. So we have kind of, so you have all these bunch of stories come from somewhere, and then they include it, and then you have, you know, the original case, and then the voice of Yuanwu and the later commentators and so on. So kind of, and of course, this is just one text. And then if you look at Buddhist literature, so we have this kind of different voices at different times, different perspective kind of coalesce and kind of come together and integrated into a particular text. But really, we are talking about religious texts as being multi-layered narratives in which we have melange of disparate elements and different voices from different times, different perspectives, and so on. And some of the things that religious text tells you are not very nice by any definition. I mean, so if you look at the illustration here, this is the story of Abraham about to kill his son. Why is he killing his son? Because God asked him to. Right? So he hears the voice of God, and God says, you should kill your son. And he takes the knife, and he's about to kill his son because he believes in God, he follows God. He's a true follower of God. So if you meet somebody like that, this is some kind of anti-religious propaganda, but I think you made a good point, right? If you go around and if you try or kill your son or daughter and say you killed it because God told you to, you're certainly going to go to prison or maybe mental asylum, but certainly that's not going to be acceptable behavior in a modern civilized society, right? And at the same time, you have this kind of story in your sacred text, a text that is supposed to contain the words of God, the creator of the universe, the source of all power, the all-knowing, wise, compassionate being that controls our destiny. So how do you deal with this? What are some of the exegetical strategies, whether it's killing cat in a charm text or Abraham about to kill his son in a biblical narrative? So what are the exegetical strategies of dealing with this kind of difficult, problematic passage, at least from a conventional ethical perspective? How do we deal with it? Because the natural, at least if you're a normal human being, is kind of to find this a little bit disturbing, maybe perplexing. And I've spoken with Christians, actually. I taught once, I was invited to give some lectures at a Christian seminary up in New Hampshire. And I brought this story and asked them kind of, how do you deal with this kind of stuff? And it was difficult. And some of them said, we tried to deal and understand. At some point we gave up. Now, one way to deal with it is to say, well, the Bible was written by some people who maybe they were violent and nasty and have some strange ideas, and this have nothing to do with God, because the Bible is a human creation and it reflects the ideas, the biases, the predispositions, the worldviews, the ethical standards of the people who wrote it. And maybe some of them had no very high ethical standards, or maybe they're trying to make a point. I mean, I'm not saying this is how you should interpret the Bible, but it's a possibility. And if you do that way, actually, you absolve God from all kinds of stuff. But if you look at biblical narratives, I mean, there is a lot of that is kind of troubling. I mean, usually when you go to church or something, there's a sermon, you know, there is a picking certain parts of the Bible, right? I mean, and much of it is kind of ignored. But again, going back to this story, so God commands Abraham to kill his son, Isaac, right? And to offer him as a sacrifice. So kill your son and offer it as a sacrifice to me. I don't know how it sounds, but to many that might sound like, if you put yourself outside of this context of belief and acceptance of the authority of the Bible and whatnot, this sounds like pretty monstrous, right? And God also is depicted pretty petty, often petty, jealous character, right? I mean, he prohibits others, for example, the Jewish people to worship other deities. So in Exodus 20, he says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Really? Is really jealousy a quality that we want to associate with an all-powerful, all-loving, compassionate deity? So you have to worship me and you cannot worship other beings because I'm very, very jealous. This maybe sounds like someone's wife or husband or something like that, but God, okay. How about when God really pissed off humanity and he says he decides to blot out from the earth the human beings he have created, and Noah is okay, so he kind of spares Noah, then pestilence, and destroys everybody else. And if you want to read this kind of stuff, there's a whole book by Dan Baker. I actually went on the reading. He came to our university to give a lecture when the book came out. So God, the more unpleasant character in all fiction. So, and of course, this is music to the ears to anti-religious types, or Richard Dawkins, who wrote the foreword to the book. And lots of stuff. I mean, really not very flattering depictions of God. And of course, the title indicates that the Bible is a work of fiction, and God, he reads that as a fictional character who is not a very nice person as a character. Now, I'm not saying this is how you should read the Bible and so on, but I'm trying to kind of provide some kind of context. You know, if you look at your tradition, you kind of understand, and maybe there is a way that Christian traditions of biblical exegesis can deal with this kind of story, interpreting as allegories and whatnot. For example, also there's the Song of Songs, which is basically infused with erotic imagery. I mean, it's almost like some kind of X-rated literature, but then it's kind of imbued with all kinds of higher meaning, both by Jewish and Christian commentators and so on. So this is not like, I'm not saying like the Bible is bad or anything like that, but there are these kind of problematic narratives, and then how does the tradition respond? How does it interpret? There are different ways to interpret them. I mean, there are different exegetical strategies you can use, but also you can just ignore it. And this is very, very common strategy. Just there are certain parts of sacred text that are not very good, that don't speak about our religion, so we just ignore them. We just don't bring them in sermon, and then we just kind of bring, so it's a god or deity or a Buddha of peace and love and wisdom and so on. And when there's some kind of negative depiction, we kind of gloss it over, kind of basically sideline it and kind of don't deal with it. Again, there is much less violence and gore and graphic imagery in Buddhist texts, which is perhaps partly what some of us might find more attractive. But having said that, also, so there's this kind of points of comparison, and bring this because I think it sheds light, like when we kind of move away from this Buddhist hermeneutical circle and we kind of look kind of from the perspective of another tradition, we step out, kind of gives you different ways of looking about these texts and interpretive traditions and so on. Now there's a big there's lots of similarities between Christian and Buddhist exegesis, but there are differences. And one of the main differences I would suggest is that according to Christian belief, there are scriptures of divine origin, right? So if the Bible, like the Hebrew Bible, for example, is the word of God, and if God can do or say no wrong, then you have to interpret it in ways that, you know, it doesn't depict wrong or problematic behavior. So you have to basically engage in mental gymnastic when it comes to this problematic part. I don't interpret this allegory or whatnot. So there is this kind of need to find deep meaning or something very valid or some kind of deep embedded message in what might be on the surface questionably morally questionable parts and so on. The Buddhist canon, on the other hand, is really human creation. Like, we don't have divine origin in Buddhism. So then, in all Buddhist teachings following the Mahayana doctrine of Upaya are provisional explanation, which brings to the fore this kind of, that actually, in theory at least, Chan teachers should have much more latitude in terms of how to interpret. So these are not divine origins. Nanquan is not a divine being. He's a human being. But at the same time, and also Chan master is supposed to be iconoclastic, to be creative, to transgress traditions. I mean, these are images. But if you look at the kind of exegetical tradition, which I think is at the center of later conceptions of Chan orthodoxy, you can see a very traditional, very conservative tradition which follows established orthodoxy. It's not veering outside of conventional models of exegesis and never really ventures in different paths, different approaches. So there are the different paths. And I kind of today, I just tried to suggest some of those paths. And very briefly, in terms of conclusions, I don't have much of a conclusion, but basically, if this sounds a little bit critical of later Chan tradition, I mean, again, this is one aspect of the Chan tradition. There's, of course, more to Chan Buddhism, and I'm talking in general terms. But if you look at these kind of issues that I brought, I mean, it looks like the Chan, especially in its later variation, is a tradition that seems to lack critical acumen and intellectual rigor. And even going back to my discussion of Chan institution, even the religious creativity and validity, and much of it is because you have this established orthodoxy, orthodox practice, orthodox text, orthodox interpretations, part of conservative institutions that are embedded in the social and religious status quo of imperial China, and then of course Japan and so on. So really, this kind of creates this kind of interpretive loop in which basically the Chan masters cannot venture outside of this interpretive box without bringing his own authority into question. And then the question I bring this is, when you have a tradition that creates this kind of stories of killing cats and then creates this kind of modes of exegesis, and when it fixates on a narrow technique of practice, and then when this becomes orthodox form of Buddhism in China, what are the long-term ramifications for the history of Buddhism, not just in China, but in East Asia? Could this be seen as a beginning of protracted decline that kind of goes into the way? So we have this creativity, philosophical, intellectual creativity, institutional vitality, and then this kind of establishment of an orthodoxy, and maybe decline again with all kinds of different possibilities there. Obviously there are revivals. I'm thinking there's some further questions here that I didn't answer today, and I'm going to leave you that. I kind of how with the time. Actually we don't have much time, so let's skip that. So I think there's much more to be said about it, but I think I already spoke long enough. So thank you for listening, and I think we have a few minutes, so maybe we can answer some questions. I think there are several.
Thank you. Let's start.
Do you have some suggestions of question might be good?
Do I need to read out to you, or you can see?
No, I can see it. I think we started early on to read, but didn't work very well.
Okay.
What's the purpose of this repetitive encounter dialogue? What's the point of repeating? I don't know. I didn't write them. I mean, we can interpret, we can guess, we can hypothesis. One way is what you have is during the Song Dynasty, you have creation of a new orthodoxy, new form of Chan orthodoxy, which then becomes really the dominant form of orthodoxy within elite Chan Buddhism, right? And it's tied up with the state. So this becomes almost like the official religion, though Buddhism is kind of also in decline in terms of its influence. I mean, it's still very influential, but you have the Confucian revival and so on, but it's complicated. So, so then you create, I don't know why people create narratives, why people create stories. So one of it is, so for example, there's so many masters in Qingde Chuan Dengdu. So why create a text? Well, first of all, is to assert the uniqueness of Chan, to assert the authority, to create a sense of history, to overwhelm. So I think what they want to do is include many monks to show that this is a tradition with many enlightened masters and so on, different lineages. And then, if you don't, this is my guess. I mean, I don't know exactly what was going on. And then these stories also become popular, but some of it seems to be manufactured. So I don't know. I can open somewhere, I don't know, page somewhere, and you can find some kind of master. Many of them are just very short. For famous master, I don't know, let's say Dongshan, for example, or Cao Shan, you will have longer, Fayan, maybe longer entries, but then some of them like some of them will be very short, might be just one story. And then you have to come up with something, so you pull up elements, and so that's my guess. It's kind of going back to this kind of mass-produced literature. You know, you just pick up elements, and there's lots of repetition, rearranging, and so on. I'm not saying some of the stories are creative. I mean, some of the stories are much more complicated and have a better mode of narration, but many of them, and again, the stories we read are the best one. Really, Nanquan is popular because it was selected as to be one of the best 100, for example, or two of the best 100s and so on. But there are so many stories in Chan literature that are, or in counter dialogues and so on, that why create something repetitive? I don't know, why not? But definitely there is a consolidation of Chan orthodoxy during the Sung and a creation of literature at the core of which are the enlightened deeds and acts of Chan masters. And this is a record of this kind of tradition that is becoming dominant within the world of Song Buddhism. So you don't have Chan. I mean, you don't have Huayan is not there really. I mean, there's some revival, but it's kind of really a shadow of Tiantai. Yeah, you have Jili and something, but compared with J, I'm sorry to say, for those of you who study Sung Dynasty Tiantai, but it's not quite there. So basically, that's one way to think. But again, I'm sorry, this is not a complete answer.
Related to that question, perhaps we may also want to ask, why did the author take Nanquan as the character of its story, not other Chan masters who also took a kind of a unconventional approach towards enlightenment?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, this is, you have to know who the author of the story is and what are the circumstances. But if you look at Gong'an collections, for some reason, Nanquan and Zhaozhou seems to be really popular. So there are a number of stories, and especially Zhaozhou. And really, if you look like when I studied Chan, the Hongzhou school, Nanquan during his lifetime was not that important. Actually, he was not a major disciple of Matsu. But then kind of these stories create, and then maybe one story created another story, and they become popular and so on. And then he emerges, like in the beginning, you introduce him as like one of the most important Chan masters and so on. But he is important not because he was important during his lifetime, but because these stories become important because he's featured. Why Nanquan? Again, I cannot say with absolute certainty that there was no some cat in his monastery and so on. But in terms of the narrative style, in terms of all these elements, I cannot be 100% sure about anything. I'm not 100% sure that I exist. I mean, I might be some kind of hologram, or I might be some kind of creation, or in some kind of matrix or something like that. I'm not sure. So I cannot be 100% sure that really Nanquan was there was no some incident featuring cat or something like that, but in terms of this kind of style of exposition, narration, storytelling, there was nothing like that at the time. So it's safe to assume that it was something that was created much later. But who created these stories, why they are created, I really don't know. And personally, for me, that's also not very important. I'm not that interested in that aspect of Sung Dynasty Chan, but I think it's important, and I'm not sure how much we can know. I mean, people have suggested, Albert Welter have written about some kind of suggestions about what are some of the narrative styles that they were using from literary writings, and so I'm not sure that's very convincing. The short answer is, I don't know, and I'm not sure we can know about it.
There is a similar story, just like this one. Probably the guy called Zhi Chang, who was also a Dharma brother of Nanquan, studied with Dao Yi. He actually, according to the story, happened to kill a snake in front of another student. So this story reads similar. So from the perspective of the creator of the stories, I think we can interpret in a conventional way. Let's say the story was created to just following a line of Manjushri holding a sword and attack the Buddha. The purpose of that story, of that kind of illustration, is to destroy the reader or the listener's illusion or attachment to anything. So that actually is based on the tradition of Prajna Buddhism. So
yes,
I think Buddhism learned a lot from Prajna, and this is a way to inherit their old tradition, just like the sixth patriarch Huiren, in his text, he went so drastic that there's no precept, but no form precept. You don't have to do meditation. Meditation is not sitting down. So this is drastic enough. Now, comparatively speaking, these two stories, killing cats, maybe have taken a step too far in the drastic approach to enlightenment. That's what how I
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's how to take it. I mean, that they have taken it too far, which I kind of would tend to agree, or maybe they are not too far because they are not to be understood literally. But this image of Manjushri taking the sword and lurching, this appears in a scripture. Actually, this is in one of the commentaries. I didn't have time to discuss, but Sung Dynasty commentary, this story from Manjushri going towards the Buddha with a sword, kind of supposedly like I'm going to kill you, to demonstrate something, non-duality, non-attachment, and whatnot. So he actually relates it to the Nanquan story. So there is that kind of connection very clear in some of the commentaries. The thing is, at the same time, I mean, I still don't see why you need the story and the violence there. We human beings are violent enough without needing religious sanction for violence. So that's why I mean, today, millions of animals across the world will be slaughtered in horrible conditions. I mean, in slaughterhouses, and people's life will be destroyed, they will spend, and then we are going to eat their flesh, and then we destroy habitats and so on, and then we kill each other, we have wars and whatnot. In America, for example, where I live, 100 people per day die from guns. 100 people per day. Okay, it's a big country and whatnot, and then we have these mass killings, and we cannot bring ourselves to have the most common sensual gun laws to prevent this kind of and stupid arguments like guns don't kill people, and if you arm everybody, then the good guys will kill. I mean, just complete nonsense, right? So that's the problem with violence. I mean, we are violent enough, so we don't need religious sanction, even mention of violence, because again, this text can be interpreted. So that's the disturbing part in terms of how this operates, in terms of this kind of higher level of understanding and so on. If you want to talk about this kind of transcendence, yeah, read the Vimalakirti scripture, and I don't know, read some good chant sermons. They talk about transcendence. You don't need this kind of stories that feature unnecessary. I don't see what you gain by this kind of story. Some people seem to like the story. I don't find it particularly good, compelling, and so on. And I think most people who are outside of this narrow Zen circle of Chan enthusiasts or Zen enthusiasts who are used to this and could think, like these stories and find them cool and interesting and stimulating, this kind of countercultural free spirit and whatnot. So that's the problem of the story. So if it's about wisdom, slicing dualities and so on, why do you need to bring cats and killing of cats and so on? What again, I don't see what's gained in terms of the larger discourse. I think in terms of the time, we are over time. I don't know, there are several questions and some of them are good. I don't know, do you think we should go ahead, try to answer, or we should just call it a day?
Well, can you take one more? The next one, we just want to ask you.
It's by Kenneth.
Yeah,
yes.
Why Buddhism, why Chan actually are prominent in Japan, in Japanese culture,
yeah,
Chinese culture?
Yeah, in Japan, so the truth in Japan, Zen Buddhism became a prominent Buddhist school with the support of the warrior class. This is kind of especially Rinzai Zen. In China, the Chao school of Buddhism also raised a prominent Buddhist school in the Sung Dynasty and beyond any particular reason. It appealed, although actually it became dominant school before the Sung. You have important developments already by the Tang, late Tang is quite important. And actually 5 dynasties really when Chan master become really closely connected with the political elites. You have different dynasties. You have Wu Yuan and kind of other dynasties in the south who are very supportive. So you have this kind of emergence of close connections between centers of imperial power and individual Chan monks. And there is no particular reason. There are many reasons. I mean, some of it have to do with the stories. Apparently, these kind of stories, this kind of literature appealed, resonated with certain audiences. There were institutional changes. this kind of coalescing of orthodoxy around certain type of monastic life, certain type of religious practice, narrowing of orthodoxy, so you don't have too much diversity. And I don't know, I can speculate here, maybe that was more appealing from the perspective of the state, but also maybe some emperors or high place officials, maybe they were impressed by this kind of Chan master. So there are all kinds of different considerations. There's no linear explanation. So you have developments in literature, development of institutions, changing images of them. But this is kind of coalescing, basically tying up with my lecture on institutionalization. So you develop this kind of institutions that are very, very stable and that are really deeply ingrained or deeply connected with the social and political institutions of the imperial state. And that kind of, you have this kind of coalescing of different factors. It's the same. I mean, you can say why Christianity emerged as a state religion in the Roman Empire. I mean, there were many, many different factors, right? But so you can, it's not just one. But some of it have to do with the creativity. I mean, on one level, so what I'm depicting here is kind of, might sound quite negative, and actually it is sort of negative in terms of analyzing larger historical developments in the role of Chan. And I suggest that this might be marking kind of long process of decline of Buddhism in China, which of course you can see also today, not just in China, but beyond China as well. But at the same time, the tradition was good in terms of connecting itself with the power brokers in Chinese society, in developing, cultivating these kind of relationships, and so on, coming up with teachings that appealed. For example, if you look at Da Hui, he was able to create, I mean, if you want to be cynical and critical, it's like this quick enlightenment scheme, like he's promising, like just follow Kanghuan, just don't do anything, just follow this technique and meditate on the Huato, and then you don't even have to abandon your office and power and so on. Actually, that's good, because then you can support me, and then you can still reach this highest reaches of Buddhist spirituality. So that appeal to people, these kind of quick enlightenment schemes. You can find that in contemporary Buddhism. We can draw analogs. We can tell you some names of teachers, especially in Korean Buddhism, where you kind of have this enlightenment for lay people to come follow me. And then, so there are many factors. I don't think there is a single factor. So you look at this. But having said that, my main specialty is Tang Dynasty Buddhism. And I'm interested, I think you have to follow these larger developmental trajectories, and also kind of look at the text, because they're composed at different times, they have different layers, and you have to do this textual archaeology. So, but anyway, it's a complicated question. That, and there are several more questions. So thank you. There were good response and good questions. I apologize, we don't have time. If you ask the question, I try to follow the question, and to see how many were early on. As I was talking, there were no questions, so I assume I will have lots of time to talk about this. And then the questions came a little bit later towards the end, and then I wanted to finish. So thank you. Maybe if you like some of them, maybe I have a tendency to talk too much, but too long. But if we have a little bit more time, maybe we can try to. Is it possible, Ben, if you can save these questions, maybe and if I can restrain myself from preparing a too long lecture for next time, maybe we can also try to address some of these questions, because some of these are not just about this, but about larger themes in the development of Chan and its place in both Chinese Buddhism and Chinese religion more generally. So, but I guess we have to stop at this point. So thank you for hosting. Thank you for moderating. And for those of you who are still there, whether via Zoom or YouTube, thank you for listening. I hope most of you will be able to join us next time. It will be the last lecture of the series. But again, thank you. Stay well.
Thank you, Professor, for this fascinating lecture, and thank you all for the for joining us, the members of audience. So that's all for tonight, and good night. Bye bye. Hope to see you all next time.
Yes.
Yeah. Bye bye.